Welcome to the debate. On February 26, 2026, diplomats in Geneva basically packed their briefcases and admitted failure.
Yeah, and just 48 hours later, stealth bombers were in the air over the Middle East.
Exactly. The diplomatic collapse that triggered Operation Lion's Roar forces us to ask, frankly, a profound question about how the world handles the most dangerous weapons on Earth.
Right. It forces us to ask what actually works when negotiations inevitably fail. We are looking at a fundamental divide in grand strategy here. Which framework is genuinely more effective in managing nuclear proliferation?
Do we rely on multilateral diplomatic containment, or
do we pivot to coercive economic and military pressure?
Right. And this debate is rooted directly in the geopolitical and legal fallout of those February strikes, alongside a pretty massive body of historical data regarding international sanctions and, of course, the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA.
Yes, the foundational text of this entire crisis.
I'll lay out my position simply. Multilateral diplomacy, despite being incredibly frustrating, is the only durable, legally sound method to constrain nuclear ambitions.
And my position is that when dealing with threshold existential threats and when diplomacy suffers from structural failure, coercive pressure and preventative military action become absolute strategic necessities.
So we have to start with a baseline of what actually works. The 2015 JCPOA is the prime example of verifiable diplomacy. We weren't relying on trusting the Iranian regime, right?
Well,
we were relying on physics and physical inspections. The agreement capped Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium at exactly 300 kilograms. It legally limited enrichment to 3.67%.
Right, which is civilian grade.
Exactly. It's standard for civilian energy, nowhere near weapons grade. Through relentless International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring, we pushed the breakout time, the time needed to dash to a bomb, to 2 full years.
Temporarily, though. The JCPOA was built on a massive structural trust deficit from day one.
How so?
The most glaring error being the sunset clauses. They would expire in 10 to 15 years, effectively providing a very patient, completely legal pathway to a bomb.
But it constrained them in the present.
While entirely ignoring Iran's ballistic missile development and its funding of proxy warfare, the axis of resistance. Classical deterrence just fails against an opaque threshold nuclear state.
I disagree that it fails.
But look at the outcome. When Geneva deadlocked over irreversible sovereign red lines, Israel and the U.S. invoked the Begin Doctrine. That is the principle of preventive military action against existential threats. They launched Operation Lion's Roar, and they successfully degraded 85% of Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
You're treating coercion as a success, but let's look at the actual data. The U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the deal in 2018, imposed maximum pressure sanctions, and basically violated international law in the process.
They established necessary boundaries.
No, that coercion pushed Iran to enrich uranium to 83.7%. The 2026 strikes only bought an 8-month delay in the program. We traded a working diplomatic framework for a massive humanitarian crisis and a vastly accelerated nuclear threat.
You characterize maximum pressure as a failure, but coercive economic pressure is exactly what forced Iran to the negotiating table in the first place back in 2015.
The initial sanctions were multilateral, not unilateral.
Sure, but you don't get your prize JCPOA without the crippling economic sanctions that preceded it. In 2018, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo laid out 12 clear demands, stopping enrichment, ending proxy support, withdrawing forces from Syria.
Which were impossible demands.
They were necessary red lines designed to force a comprehensive treaty rather than a flawed, temporary executive agreement. You have to restrict the resources of a state sponsor of terrorism to change its behavior.
But if the goal was to change behavior, the mechanism completely backfired. Applying maximum open-ended sanctions it's like pulling a Band-Aid off too quickly.
How so?
If you apply sanctions incrementally, the target country feels the pain and has a direct incentive to come to the table to stop that specific pain. When you just rip the Band-Aid off and apply absolute maximum sanctions instantly, you leave the target country with nothing left to lose.
They had their economy to lose.
The pain is maximized immediately, so your leverage vanishes. Look at the actual mechanism of their response.
They were forced to scramble for economic survival.
Right, they built the resistance economy, Rather than collapsing and begging for a new deal, Tehran was forced into a massive geostrategic pivot. They signed a 25-year, $400 billion strategic partnership with China, completely circumventing Western financial systems.
Which is a desperate move.
But it worked for them. We didn't starve the nuclear program, we decimated the civilian middle class. Food inflation hit 66% in late 2025. 80% of the middle class was pushed into relying on government handouts.
Yes, sanctions are blunt instruments.
You made the population wholly dependent on the very authoritarian regime you were trying to weaken.
Authoritarian regimes rely on economic stability to maintain control, though. The strategy was to strain the regime's capacity to fund its nuclear and regional ambitions. The fact that the regime chose to prioritize its nuclear infrastructure over its citizens' food security proved the exact nature of the threat we are dealing with.
I mean, that's a convenient way to justify mass civilian suffering.
The resources they lost were resources that couldn't be sent to Hezbollah or Hamas.
Look, when the executive branch enforced those sanctions, we compromised our own constitutional checks and balances to wage this economic war. We really need to examine the domestic legal overreach of these sanctions.
Oh, you mean the domestic court battles?
Yes. The executive branch utilized emergency powers, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, and the National Emergencies Act, to act completely unilaterally. But the courts pushed back. Look at the landmark case VOS Selections, Inc. v. Trump.
The Federal Circuit ruling on tariffs, right?
Right. The court struck down executive orders that imposed broad tariffs under the guise of national emergencies. And they didn't just disagree on policy. They ruled based on the non-delegation doctrine and the major questions doctrine.
Right.
To explain the mechanism here, the Constitution gives Congress the power over foreign trade and tariffs. The non-delegation doctrine essentially means Congress cannot just hand a blank check of legislative power to the president.
Sure.
The executive branch cannot declare a perpetual emergency to wield unbounded economic coercion without clear, intelligible principles provided by Congress.
And the major questions doctrine argues that if an agency or the executive wants to make a decision of vast economic and political significance, they need clear congressional authorization.
Precisely. By governing through perpetual executive emergencies, we undermine the very rule of law we claim to be upholding globally. It is an unsustainable foundation for foreign policy.
I hear that, but you are elevating a procedural domestic law dispute over an existential foreign policy necessity.
The rule of law isn't a mere procedural dispute.
The executive branch is granted those emergency powers precisely because national security requires swift, decisive action that a gridlock Congress cannot physically provide. But your focus on the legal mechanics of sanctions ignores the structural reality of the diplomacy you're defending.
Okay, let's talk about the diplomacy then.
We need to talk about why the talks in 2021 through 2026 actually failed. The core issue is the stability-instability paradox.
Ah, right. You're talking about the geopolitical phenomenon where mutual deterrence at the highest level, like the fear of a massive nuclear or conventional war, actually acts as a shield, making lower-level subnuclear conflict more likely.
Exactly. By granting Iran a diplomatic shield for its nuclear program through the JCPOA, the international community inadvertently enabled them to safely escalate subnuclear proxy warfare.
But that's a separate issue.
It's entirely connected. The West was terrified of derailing the nuclear agreement, so Iran faced zero massive retaliation for arming and funding Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis across the Middle East. The JCPOA treated the nuclear file in a total vacuum, ignoring the reality on the ground.
Because the nuclear file is an existential threat to the entire globe.
But Iran's absolute demand in the 2026 Geneva talks to keep domestic enrichment capabilities wasn't just about national pride. It was a structural block to true regional security. They explicitly wanted to maintain their threshold nuclear status to permanently protect their proxy network.
Proxy warfare is highly destabilizing. Yes, I completely agree. But I struggle to see how blowing up the one treaty we had fixes that.
It removes the shield.
Blowing up the treaty that physically prevented the creation of a nuclear weapon doesn't solve the proxy issue. It just adds a nuclear bomb to the equation. Is it not a fundamental strategic error to sacrifice a working monitoring regime just because it doesn't magically solve every centuries-old regional conflict simultaneously?
It wasn't a working monitoring regime, though. It was a countdown clock. The sunset clauses meant that even if Iran followed every single rule, they would eventually have a completely legal, massive enrichment program.
But without the JCPOA, the international community lost all visibility. We entered a complete verification deadlock.
Because they wouldn't cooperate?
When the deal collapsed, the IAEA cameras were turned off. The inspectors were restricted. Let's talk about what that physically means on the ground. Under the agreement, we had environmental sampling. We knew exactly how many centrifuges were spinning. We knew the flow of uranium gas.
Which was a luxury we paid too high a price for.
Once the maximum pressure approach destroyed that framework, we went totally blind. We went from knowing exactly where every ounce of fissile material was to guessing based on satellite imagery. A flawed but verifiable deal is exponentially safer than a completely blind environment.
A blind environment wouldn't be an issue if the facilities didn't exist in the first place.
Well, they do exist.
Because the talks broke down, because of that insurmountable structural trust deficit, where the U.S. couldn't bind future administrations and Iran wouldn't stop enriching, we arrived at February 2026. Geneva collapses, and the physical reality on the ground was that Iran was enriching uranium at 83.7% at the Fordo and Natanz facilities.
A level of enrichment they only pursued after the coercive pressure campaign began and the original deal was violated by the United States.
Regardless of the timeline, 83.7% is the reality we had to face in February 2026. And we need to be very clear about the physics of uranium enrichment here, because it is not a linear scale.
You are referring to the Separative Work Unit, or SWSU effort?
Right. Going from natural uranium at 0.7% up to 20% enrichment takes a massive amount of time, energy, and centrifuge spinning. It is the vast bulk of the work.
Yeah, it's the hardest part.
But going from 20% to 60% and then to 83.7% takes a fraction of the effort. At 83.7%, you have essentially done 95% of the work required to reach 90% weapons-grade material. The jump from 83 to 90 is literally a matter of days.
And your argument is that this physical proximity to a weapon overrides the diplomatic process entirely.
Absolutely. When the centrifuges are spinning that fast, the threat of weaponization is imminent. You cannot rely on a slow diplomatic process in Geneva. This is the logic of the Begin Doctrine. Israel successfully applied this in 1981 when they destroyed the Osirak reactor in Iraq, and again in 2007 against the Al-Kabar reactor in Syria.
Those were very different contexts.
The doctrine states that a nation has the right to preemptively strike an adversary to prevent them from acquiring weapons of mass destruction, especially an adversary that has repeatedly sworn to destroy you. Operation Lion's Roar was the necessary physical corrective to a failed diplomatic experiment. It degraded 85% of their nuclear sites.
You call it a necessary corrective, but military necessity does not just override international law. You invoke the Begin Doctrine, but that is merely an operational posture of a specific state. It is not a recognized legal standard.
It's the reality of survival.
The actual customary international law governing anticipatory self-defense is the Caroline Standard.
Formulated in the 19th century, right?
Yes, stemming from an 1837 incident, but it remains the bedrock of international law for a very important reason. It prevents states from just bombing each other based on paranoia. The Caroline Standard requires a threat to be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation.
Exactly.
It demands absolute imminence. Now, look at the facts of February 28, 2026. Was there an overwhelming instant nuclear threat that day? No.
At 83.7%, the moment for deliberation has passed.
Not according to our own intelligence. An unnamed U.S. official on a press call the very day of the strikes explicitly stated that the short-term threat posing a risk to the U.S. and allies was a conventional threat, specifically conventional missile movements in the southern belt. It was not an active nuclear weapon being loaded onto a warhead.
The threshold status itself is the threat. If you wait for the weapon to be fully assembled, mounted on a ballistic missile, and rolled out onto a launch pad, deterrence has already failed. You are trapped.
Look at the practical strategic outcome of the strikes. You claim an 85% degradation of infrastructure. But what is infrastructure? It's concrete, wiring and metal tubes.
It's the capacity to build a bomb.
You bombed buildings, but you cannot bomb knowledge. The nuclear scientists are still alive. The blueprints exist. Comprehensive analyses show that Operation Lion's Roar bought roughly 8 months of delay in the nuclear program. 8 months. In exchange, global oil prices surged over 40%, triggering severe economic shockwaves.
We established a firm boundary that diplomacy failed to create.
You establish a massive incentive for them to weaponize. By striking their facilities, you practically guarantee a long-term scenario where Iran completely withdraws from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They will reconstitute their program.
They were doing that anyway under the guise of the JCPOA.
But this time, they won't build it in facilities we can see. They will build it in deeper, heavily hardened facilities hollowed out of mountains, completely unrestrained by any international legal framework. It accelerates the security dilemma. You teach a state that the only way to avoid being bombed is to actually possess the nuclear weapon.
The security dilemma was already in full swing. Iran was utilizing the cover of diplomacy to inch closer and closer to that threshold. If you do not enforce a red line with physical consequence, the red line ceases to exist in the mind of the adversary.
Even if the consequence creates a worse situation?
Yes, military strikes might offer only a tactical delay, but sometimes a tactical delay is the only way to reset the board. You force the adversary to spend years rebuilding, expending massive resources on concrete and centrifuges that otherwise would have gone into funding their proxy networks or further weapons development.
We had them constrained for a decade under the JCPOA. We didn't need to reset the board. We needed to stay at the table. We walked away from a functioning framework, smashed the board to pieces, and are now claiming a strategic victory because we delayed their next move by 8 months.
We walked away because the board was tilted from the start. The JCPOA allowed Iran to keep a massive domestic enrichment infrastructure intact. The fundamental flaw was believing you could neatly parse out the nuclear threat from the regime's overall strategic posture.
That's how arms control works.
When Secretary Pompeo demanded an end to proxy support alongside the nuclear concessions, he was pointing out a holistic reality. You cannot treat an isolated symptom when the underlying geopolitical condition is entirely antagonistic.
We need to look purely at the mechanisms of statecraft. Bombing a sovereign nation's nuclear infrastructure creates massive systemic shock. The underlying geopolitical friction remains entirely unresolved, and now you've removed the only mechanism we had for communication and de-escalation.
Communication only works when both sides share the same definition of stability.
This cuts to the core of our disagreement on the material, I think. Let me just summarize my read on this.
Go ahead.
Diplomacy, particularly multilateral containment, is agonizingly difficult. It is slow. It requires making deeply uncomfortable concessions with actors we fundamentally distrust. But it establishes binding, verifiable constraints based on physics and international inspections. It upholds the bedrock of international law. In contrast, economic coercion and military force, as demonstrated by the Maximum Pressure Campaign and Operation Lion's Roar, they yield incredibly short-term tactical gains. Buying 8 months of delay is not a strategic victory when it causes a massive global economic shock, fractures international coalitions, and all but guarantees a covert, hardened nuclear program in the future.
And looking at the exact same empirical record, I conclude the opposite. When the international community deals with threshold actors, regimes that explicitly exploit diplomatic cover and verification deadlocks to stealthily advance their military capabilities, we simply cannot rely on structurally flawed agreements.
Even if they cap enrichment.
The JCPOA ignored the stability and stability paradox that fueled regional proxy wars and promised sunset clauses that just paved the way to a bomb anyway. When a state leverages the physics of enrichment to reach 83.7%, the luxury of protracted negotiations evaporates. Credible threats, severe economic sanctions, and preventive military coercion like Operation Lion's Roar are sometimes the only realistic mechanisms to check proliferation. Survival is a prerequisite to diplomacy.
I think where we ultimately find convergence is acknowledging the profound structural difficulty of the commitment problem.
Absolutely.
In our modern political systems, neither side truly trusts the other to uphold an agreement across changing political administrations. The U.S. executive branch couldn't permanently bind Congress, and Iran's leadership refused to trust the next American election cycle.
Yeah, that commitment problem makes any durable treaty incredibly difficult to ratify and sustain, and we can certainly agree that the February 2026 military strikes have fundamentally altered the landscape of Middle Eastern security.
Without a doubt.
The IAEA cameras are completely dark, the red lines are blurred, and geopolitical alliances are rapidly shifting, with China and Russia positioning themselves in the vacuum left by this escalation.
It is a completely new, highly volatile strategic environment.
It really is. The tension between international legal constraints and immediate national security imperatives requires deeply nuanced statecraft. Statecraft that recognizes the limitations of both paper agreements and precision munitions.
Well said.
There are many more layers to explore in this historical and strategic material, from the shifting role of the Gulf states to the intricacies of nuclear supply chains. We leave you to weigh the evidence. When looking at the geopolitical reality of nuclear proliferation, does the environment demand the slow, verifiable constraints of diplomacy or the coercive, immediate intervention of force? We'll leave that to you to decide.